The augmented super soldier's titanium-reinforced boot crushed the skull of the Cation raider like an overripe melon as Lieutenant Dylan Campbell stormed into the Arcturus Starbase Command Center, his 8'2" frame barely fitting through the door. Pollux, the feline ambassador, yowled in shock at the gore-splattered giant glowering down at him, a far cry from the fragile humans his kind sought to conquer. 5 years ago, the technologically superior Cations invaded Earth, expecting an easy victory over the soft, weak humans, but humanity refused to surrender, and in an act of desperate genius, they transformed themselves into monsters. Soldiers like Dylan volunteered to become Orcs, undergoing an experimental process that turned them into towering super soldiers, titans of muscle and metal standing over 8 feet tall, capable of crushing Cation warriors with their bare hands. The excruciating surgeries killed many, but Earth had no choice. It was fight back or face extinction. "By the Huntress, I thought the stories of your kind were myths," Pollux hissed, backing away in fear. "Are all Earth warriors as large as you now?" Dylan smirked cruelly. "No, I'm one of the runts, and trust me, Furface, you ain't seen nothing yet." He clenched a fist the size of the ambassador's head. "Your kind wanted to enslave us. Now it's humanity's turn to show you the true meaning of subjugation." The nightmarish vision before Pollux was undeniable proof. The easy conquest the Cations planned had turned into a hellish quagmire. Humanity's grim tenacity and reckless augmentations were turning the tide. And Dylan was here to make sure Earth would win this war, or die trying. After staring down Pollux, Dylan stomped out of the command center, his boots leaving dents in the metal deck plating. He navigated the winding corridors of the Arcturus starbase, passing human personnel who saluted him and scurried out of his way, along with a few Cation prisoners who shrank back in fear, hissing and spitting. Dylan arrived at the briefing room where his new CO, Colonel Jake Hernandez, was waiting. Jake was a fellow Ayug, standing a head taller than Dylan, with arms like tree trunks. His face was heavily scarred from countless battles, and one eye had been repinfused with a glowing red cybernetic implant. "Lieutenant Campbell reporting as ordered, sir," Dylan said, snapping a salute that could crush a man's skull. "At ease, Lieutenant," Jake replied, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Glad to have you aboard. I'll cut right to the chase. Arcturus is the linchpin of this whole damn war. It guards the Orpheus Corridor, the main hyperspace route between the core worlds and the outer colonies where the Furfaces are pushing hard. If we lose the starbase, the Cations can cut off our supply lines and choke us out." Jake tapped a few keys on the holographic display, bringing up a map of the surrounding systems. "I'm putting you in charge of Fire Team Cerberus, a platoon of AUG troopers. Your job is to reinforce the starbase's marine detachment and make it damn clear to the kitties that we're not giving up Arcturus without a fight. Intel suggests they're massing for a major offensive to take the base. It'll be up to you and your AUGs to hold the line." Dylan nodded grimly, the weight of the responsibility settling on his massive shoulders. "We'll give 'em hell, sir. The only way they're taking this base is over our cold, dead bodies." Jake clasped Dylan's shoulder, his augmented fingers digging into the dense muscle. "That's the spirit, Lieutenant. But let's be real. We're living on borrowed time, you and me. No AUG has made it past 6 years after the treatments. We're in year 5 of this war, and nobody knows how much longer we'll last." Dylan met his CO's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They were the living dead, monsters created to fight monsters. Every day, every battle, was a roll of the dice. As if on cue, Dylan's body spasmed with a sudden jolt of pain, a reminder of the constant maintenance his augmented form required. He gritted his teeth and rode out the agony, refusing to show weakness. "I got to go get my tune-up, sir," he said through clenched jaws. "Can't have my parts falling off in the middle of a firefight." Jake chuckled darkly. "Go on then, get yourself patched up. We'll need you in top shape for what's coming." Dylan saluted once more and staggered out of the briefing room, his enhanced muscles twitching and spasming. As he made his way to the medical bay, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd live long enough to see Earth victorious, or if he and his fellow AUGs would burn out like meteors, their lives spent to buy humanity a fighting chance. The medical bay was a hive of activity as ARG troopers cycled through for their regular treatments, the air filled with the hiss of hydraulics and the clanking of metal on metal. Dylan lay on an examination table, gritting his teeth as the medtechs worked on his augmented body, replacing worn servos and topping off the synthetic blood that kept his enhanced muscles oxygenated. As the techs finished up, Dylan sat up and rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar tug of scar tissue stretching across his reinforced skeleton. He was about to hop off the table when a booming voice echoed across the bay. "Dylan, is that you, you son of a bitch?" Dylan turned to see a hulking figure striding towards him, a grin splitting a face he'd recognize anywhere, even after all these years. "Marco? Holy shit, man, what are you doing here?" Sergeant Marco Russo, Dylan's old friend and squadmate from their days in AUG training, clasped Dylan's hand in a bone-crushing grip. Marco had always been a big guy, but the augmentation process had turned him into a veritable mountain of muscle and metal. "I'm with Fireteam Cerberus now," Marco said. "Heard you were taking command. Looks like we'll be fighting side by side again, just like old times." Dylan laughed, the sound almost foreign to his own ears. "Damn, it's good to see you, Marco. I thought you'd bought the farm for sure after that clusterfuck on Rigel 4. Marco's grin faded, his eyes taking on a haunted look. "Nearly did. Spent 6 months in a Region tank after that one, but I made it through, and now I'm back in the fight." As they walked out of the medical bay, catching up on lost time, Marco leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, Dylan, there's something you need to know. I've been working with a team of AUG scientists, trying to find a way to extend our lifespans. We think we might be close to a breakthrough." Dylan stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. "Are you serious? I thought that was impossible." Marco shook his head. "Nothing's impossible, man. We just need more time and resources to make it happen. I was hoping you could help us out, put in a good word with the brass." Dylan chewed his lip, not wanting to get his hopes up. He'd seen too many of his fellow ARGs succumb to the inevitable breakdown of their enhanced bodies, their lives cut short by the very process that made them into living weapons. "I don't know, Marco. I don't want to make any promises I can't keep." Before Marco could respond, a deafening klaxon split the air, red lights flashing along the corridor. Dylan's enhanced hearing picked up the crackle of the intercom, Colonel Hernandez's voice booming through the starbase. "Attention all personnel. Long-range sensors have detected a massive Caitian fleet emerging from hyperspace at the edge of the system. All combat units, report to your stations immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Dylan and Marco locked eyes, the weight of the moment settling over them like a shroud. They'd known this day was coming, but the reality of it still hit like a punch to the gut. "Looks like that breakthrough will have to wait," Dylan said grimly. "We've got a job to do." As they raced through the corridors towards the dropship bays, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that this battle would be different from any they'd faced before. The sheer size of the Caitian fleet, the desperation in their attack. It felt like everything was riding on this one final push. He knew that he and his fellow AUG troopers would have to fight harder than ever before, pushing their enhanced bodies and minds to the absolute limit. They were the last line of defense, the only thing standing between the Caitians and total victory. As he strapped himself into the dropship, watching his platoon load up around him, Dylan felt a grim sense of purpose settle over him. This was what he'd been made for, what all the AUGs had been made for. To hold the line no matter the consequences, to give humanity a chance at survival, even if it meant sacrificing their own. The dropship shuddered as it lifted off, the roar of its engines drowning out all other sound. Dylan closed his eyes, focusing on the steady thrum of his own enhanced heartbeat. One way or another, this would be the fight of their lives. The dropship's engines roared as Dylan and his platoon prepared to deploy, checking their weapons and armor one last time. The bay doors hissed open, revealing the cavernous launch deck of the Arcturus starbase. But before they could disembark, A commotion near the entrance caught their attention. Two nervous-looking guards escorted a familiar figure towards them, Pollux, the Cation ambassador. The feline alien's fur was ruffled, and his ears were flattened against his skull, but he held his head high as he approached Dillon. "Lieutenant Campbell," Pollux said, his voice tight with tension, "I must speak with you urgently in private." Dillon's eyes narrowed, his augmented senses picking up the ambassador's elevated heart rate and the acrid scent of fear. He glanced at Marco, who shrugged, then back at Pollux. "Make it quick," Dillon growled. "We've got a battle to fight." He motioned for the guards to stay put, and led Pollux into a small side room, sealing the door behind them. The Cassian ambassador paced back and forth, his tail lashing anxiously. "I know you have no reason to trust me," Pollux began, "but I come to you now not as an enemy but as a potential ally." Dillon crossed his arms, his massive frame dwarfing the alien. "I'm listening." Pollux took a deep breath. "Not all Cassians support this war. There is a faction within our government led by my own father that seeks to overthrow the warmongering leadership and sue for peace with humanity." Dillon's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "And why should I believe you?" "Because I'm risking everything by coming to you," Pollux said, his voice cracking with emotion. "If I'm discovered, I'll be branded a traitor and executed, but I believe peace is worth fighting for, even if it costs me my life." The Org trooper studied Pollux's face, searching for any sign of deceit. His enhanced senses could detect lies with uncanny accuracy, but the Cassians seemed to be telling the truth. "What do you want from me?" Dillon asked, his voice gruff but not entirely hostile. "I need you to delay the incoming Cassian fleet," Pollux said, his eyes pleading. "Give my father and his allies more time to gather support and put their plans into action. In return, I can give you valuable intelligence on the Cassian battle plans and the location of a hidden supply base. If you destroy it, you could cripple their offensive." Dillon's mind raced, weighing the risks and rewards. The information Pollux offered could save countless human lives, but he'd also sworn an oath to defend the starbase at all costs, and there was always the chance this could be an elaborate trap. He thought of his fellow Orcs fighting and dying to hold the line. He thought of the civilians back on Earth, praying for a miracle, and he thought of the future he'd never see, cut short by the very enhancements that made him a living weapon. In the end, there was only one choice he could make. "I'll do it," Dillon said, his voice like steel. "But on one condition, you stay on the starbase as collateral. If this is a trick, you'll be the first to pay the price." Pollux nodded solemnly. "I accept your terms. I will not betray your trust." The two spent the next few minutes huddled over a holomap, working out the details of their daring plan. When they emerged from the room, Dillon's face was set with unyielding commitment. He strode over to his waiting platoon, his boots ringing on the deck plates. "Change of plans," he announced, his voice carrying over the din of the launch bay. "We've got a new mission, and it could change the course of this whole damn war." As he briefed them on the details, Dillon could see the mix of hope and uncertainty in their eyes. They knew the odds were stacked against them, but the chance for peace and a future beyond war was worth fighting for. "I won't lie to you," Dillon said, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "This is going to be the hardest fight of our lives, but if we succeed, we could end this war once and for all." He slammed a fresh power cell into his pulse rifle, the weapon humming to life in his hands. "So let's get out there and show those fur-faced bastards what humanity is made of. Hurrah!" "Hurrah!" his platoon echoed, their voices ringing with fierce grit. As they boarded the dropship, ready to launch into the chaos of battle, Dillon felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He knew he might not survive the day, but for the first time in years, he dared to hope. Hope for victory, hope for peace, hope for a future beyond the endless cycle of war and death. And he would fight like hell to make that hope a reality. The dropship's engines roared as it streaked away from the Arcturus starbase, carrying Dillon and his platoon towards the Cassian supply base. The intel provided by Pollux had been invaluable, detailing the facility's layout and weak points. But as they approached their target, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "There's barely any activity down there," Marco said, peering through the viewport at the sprawling complex below. "You think they're onto us?" Dylan shook his head. "No way. Pollux's info checked out. They're probably just running a skeleton crew." The dropship touched down in a remote corner of the base, its cloaking field shimmering as it blended into the surrounding terrain. Dylan and his Orc troopers disembarked, their heavy boots crunching on the rocky ground. "It's all right, you know the drill," Dylan said, his voice low and steady. "Plant the charges, max out the damage, and get the hell out. And stay sharp. Just because it looks quiet doesn't mean it is." The platoon split into teams, each one tasked with hitting a different section of the base. Dylan led his group towards the main munitions depot, a massive warehouse filled with stacks of Cation weapons and equipment. They moved swiftly and silently, their augmented muscles and reflexes allowing them to cover ground within human speed and agility. Within minutes, they'd reached their target and begun planting the explosives, working with the precision and coordination of a well-oiled machine. But just as Dylan was about to arm the final charge, a burst of energy sizzled past his head, missing him by inches. He spun around to see a squad of Cation soldiers pouring into the warehouse, their weapons blazing. "Contact!" he yelled, diving for cover behind a stack of crates. His platoon responded instantly, returning fire with their pulse rifles and grenade launchers. The firefight was intense, the air filled with the scream of energy bolts and the crump of explosions. The Cations were tough and well-trained, but they were no match for the Orc troopers' enhanced strength and speed. Dylan vaulted over his cover, closing the distance to the nearest Cation soldier in a blur of motion. He lashed out with a titanium-reinforced fist, feeling bones crunch as he connected with the feline warrior's jaw. The Cation went down hard, his weapon clattering to the floor. As Dylan reached for the fallen soldier's rifle, he froze, staring at the strange angular design. It was unlike any Cation weapon he'd seen before, its barrel glowing with an eerie green light. He snatched up the rifle, examining it more closely. The weapon hummed with power, its energy cells pulsing with an unfamiliar frequency. Dylan had a sinking feeling that this was no ordinary gun. His suspicions were confirmed a moment later, when Marco cried out in pain, stumbling back from a glancing hit to his armored chestplate. The new Cation weapon had punched right through the reinforced metal, leaving a smoking hole in its wake. "Fall back," Dylan ordered, laying down covering fire as his platoon disengaged from the Cations. "We've got what we came for. Now let's blow this place and get out of here." They fought their way back to the dropship, the mysterious Cation rifle slung across Dylan's back. As they lifted off, he armed the detonator, watching grimly as the supply base erupted in a chain of massive explosions, the shockwaves buffeting their ship. Back on Arcturus, Dylan presented the captured weapon to Colonel Hernandez, his face grim. "The Cations have a new toy," he said, "and it packs one hell of a punch. Our armor might as well be tissue paper against this thing." Hernandez frowned, turning the rifle over in his hands. "We'll get it to the eggheads in R&D, see if they can figure out a countermeasure. In the meantime, good work out there, Lieutenant. Pollux's intel was on the money. Losing that supply base has the kitties scrambling." But the glow of victory was short-lived. Barely an hour later, the starbase's long-range sensors lit up with a swarm of incoming contacts, another Cation fleet, far larger than the last, and filled with the same deadly new weapons. In the command center, Dylan and Hernandez pored over the tactical displays, their faces tight with tension. "They're not wasting any time," Hernandez growled, "and with those new guns our usual defenses won't stand a chance." Dylan stared at the holo map, his augmented mind racing through possibilities and scenarios. The Cations had them outgunned and outnumbered, but the Orc troopers had never backed down from a fight before. They just needed a plan, a way to even the odds. "What about the Orpheus corridor?" he asked, pointing to the narrow band of hyperspace that the starbase guarded. "If we can lure them into the passage, use the gravitational anomalies to our advantage." Hernandez nodded slowly, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "It's risky as hell, but it might just work. We'll need every ship we've got, and some damn precise timing." As the Cation fleet drew closer, the tension on the starbase spiked to unbearable levels. Soldiers and civilians alike knew that this battle would decide not just their own fates, but perhaps the course of the entire war. And at the center of it all stood Dillon and his Orc troopers, the last line of defense against the coming storm. They would fight to their last breath, pushing their augmented bodies beyond the breaking point, all for the slimmest chance of victory. In the final moments before the battle began, Dillon gathered his platoon in the dropship bay, his voice ringing with a fierce, desperate energy. "I won't mince words," he said, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "This is going to be the hardest damn thing we've ever done, but if we can pull it off, we might just turn the tide of this whole war." He hefted his pulse rifle, the weapon thrumming with barely contained power. "So let's get out there and show these furry bastards what humanity is really made of. Let's make them regret the day they ever set foot on our world." As the dropship screamed out of the starbase's hangar, hurtling towards the oncoming Cation fleet, Dillon felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This was what he'd been made for, what all the Orc troopers had been made for. Not just to fight, but to protect, to safeguard the future of their species against impossible odds. And as the first enemy ships came into view, their hulls dripping with the eerie green glow of their new weapons, Dillon knew that one way or another, this would be the defining moment of their lives. The dropship shuddered as the first volley of enemy fire slammed into their shields, the energy bolts sizzling through the void like viridian lightning. In the cockpit, the pilot cursed, wrenching the controls to evade the deadly onslaught. 30 seconds to drop, he yelled over the scream of the engines. "Hang on back there." Dillon braced himself against the bulkhead, his platoon arrayed behind him, their faces grim and determined beneath their helmets. They all knew the odds they were facing, the sheer scale of the enemy force bearing down on them. But they also knew what was at stake, not just their own lives, but the lives of every human in the galaxy. If the Cations broke through the Arcturus defenses, if they gained control of the Orpheus corridor, it would be a disaster beyond imagining. So as the dropship hurtled towards the swirling maelstrom of battle, Dillon steeled himself for the fight to come. He thought of Earth, of the billions of souls counting on him and his fellow Orc troopers to be their shield and their sword. And he thought of the promise he'd made, the vow that had carried him through every firefight and every desperate charge, to hold the line, at any expense, to stand firm against the darkness, even if it meant his own life. The dropship shuddered again, a bone-rattling impact that nearly threw Dillon from his feet. Smoke began to fill the cabin, acrid and thick, as warning klaxons blared in his ears. "We're hit," the pilot shouted, his voice ragged with fear. "Brace for impact." The ship lurched sickeningly, its artificial gravity flickering as it spun out of control. Dillon glimpsed a flash of the enemy fleet through the viewport, a vast armada of ships, their hulls glinting with the deadly green light of their new weapons. And then, with a final shuddering groan, the dropship slammed into the unforgiving metal of the Cation flagship's hull, and everything went black. Dillon awoke to the taste of blood in his mouth and the acrid stench of burning circuitry. The dropship's twisted remains creaked and groaned around him as he dragged himself to his feet, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side. Emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the faces of his platoon as they stirred and checked themselves for injuries. "Sound off," Dillon barked, his voice ragged. "Who's still in one piece?" One by one his Orc troopers reported in, battered but alive. Marco was the last to respond, his armor scorched and dented. "I'm good, boss," he said, flashing a pained grin. "But I think we pissed them off." A thunderous boom shook the wrecked ship, followed by the shrill whine of energy weapons. The Cations were wasting no time pressing their attack. Dillon forced open the dropship's hatch, the twisted metal screeching in protest. Beyond lay a scene of utter chaos, The starbase's hull was pockmarked with glowing craters, its defenses struggling to hold back the relentless onslaught of the Cation ships. Emerald beams of energy sliced through the void, shattering shields and melting armor with terrifying ease. "We need to get to the command center," Dylan shouted over the din of battle. "Move now!" They charged into the fray, pulse rifles spitting blue-white bolts of plasma at the Cation borders, swarming across the hull. The feline warriors were quick and agile, their new weapons tearing through the Orc troopers' armor like paper. Dylan watched in horror as one of his soldiers took a direct hit, the energy beam reducing him to a smoldering husk in seconds. "Keep pushing!" he roared, his own rifle blazing as he cut down a pair of Cations with well-aimed shots. "We can't let them take the base!" But even as they fought with all the strength and speed their augmented bodies could muster, it was clear they were outmatched. The Cations seemed to be everywhere, their numbers inexhaustible, their weapons unstoppable. A klaxon blared over the starbase's intercom, barely audible over the screams and explosions. "All personnel evacuate immediately. The base is lost. I repeat, the base is lost." Dylan's heart sank as he heard Colonel Hernandez's voice, strained and desperate. If the commander had given the order to abandon the base, then all was truly lost. "Dylan," Marco yelled, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "We need to fall back. We can't hold them." Dylan hesitated, his instincts warring with his duty. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to keep fighting, to make the Cations pay for every inch of ground. But he knew Marco was right. They'd be slaughtered if they stayed. "All units fall back to the reactor core," he ordered over the comm. "We'll make our stand there." They fought their way through the twisting corridors of the base, the Cations hounding their every step. Bulkheads shattered, and consoles exploded as stray energy beams struck home, filling the air with sparks and shrapnel. The Orc troopers gave as good as they got, their weapons scything down the enemy in droves, but there were always more to take their place. By the time they reached the massive blast doors of the reactor chamber, their numbers had been cut in half. Dylan's armor was scorched and battered, his body aching from a dozen wounds. Beside him, Marco leaned heavily against the wall, clutching a bleeding gash in his side. "This is it, boss," he said, his voice thin with pain. "End of the line." Dylan nodded grimly, keying in the access code to the reactor controls. The chamber was a vast, pulsing mass of energy, its swirling core casting an eerie blue glow over everything. He knew that with a few keystrokes, he could overload the reactor, turning it into a makeshift bomb that would vaporize the base and everything around it, including the Cation ships, including himself and his remaining troops. His finger hovered over the final command, hesitating. It was the only way to stop the Cations from taking the base, from gaining a foothold in the Orpheus corridor. But the cost. Suddenly the blast doors hissed open, and Dylan spun, rifle raised, expecting to see a horde of Cation warriors pouring into the chamber. Instead, he found himself face to face with Pollux, the Cassian ambassador, flanked by a dozen of his own soldiers. For a moment, Dylan was certain he'd been betrayed, that Pollux had played him for a fool. But then the ambassador spoke, his voice urgent and strained. "Lieutenant Campbell, wait, don't overload the reactor." Dylan's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't blow us all to hell right now." "Because the war is over," Pollux said, his eyes wide and earnest. "My father's faction has seized control of the Cation government. The ships attacking the base are the last remnants of the old regime, desperate to strike a final blow against your kind." Marco let out a bitter laugh, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. "And we're just supposed to take your word for it, after everything your kind has done?" Pollux spread his hands, his claws retracted in a gesture of peace. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm telling you the truth. If we can defeat these last loyalists, the war will finally be over. My people are ready to sue for peace." Dylan hesitated, torn between hope and suspicion. He'd seen too many of his fellow soldiers die at the hands of the Cations to believe that peace could be so easily won. But if there was even a chance... "What do you need from us?" he asked, lowering his rifle a fraction. "Your help," Pollux said simply. My soldiers and I can't defeat the Loyalists alone. But together, with your AUG troopers fighting alongside us, we might just stand a chance. Dylan looked to Marco, saw the same mix of doubt and desperate hope in his friend's eyes. They both knew the risks, the odds stacked against them. But if there was even a sliver of a chance to end this war, to secure a future for their kind... All right, Dylan said at last, his voice grim. We'll fight with you. But if this is a trick... It's not, Pollux assured him, his tone solemn. I stake my life on it. Together, the unlikely allies took up positions around the reactor core, pulse rifles and Cation energy weapons aimed at the blast doors. They knew the Loyalist forces would be coming, drawn by the lure of the base's vital power source. It would be a battle unlike any they'd faced before, AUG troopers and Cation rebels standing side by side against a common foe. The first wave of Loyalists burst through the doors in a hail of emerald fire, their weapons screeching as they clashed against the defenders' armor. Dylan and his soldiers fought back with everything they had, their enhanced reflexes and strength allowing them to match the Cation's agility and speed. Beside them, Pollux and his rebels proved to be surprisingly effective allies, their own weapons cutting through the Loyalists' ranks with deadly precision. The ambassador himself fought with a ferocity that belied his diplomatic background, his claws and fangs flashing as he grappled with his own kind. But even with their combined might, the tide of battle seemed to be turning against them. The Loyalists kept coming, heedless of their losses, driven by a fanatical desire to crush the rebellion and see humanity burn. Dylan felt his strength flagging, his wounds taking their toll. Beside him, Marco staggered, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers as a stray energy bolt seared across his chest. One by one the defenders fell, until only a handful remained, backed up against the pulsing reactor core. Just as all seemed lost, Dylan heard Marco cry out, his voice filled with sudden, desperate hope. Dylan, the reactor! I think I can use it to boost our augmentations. Dylan risked a glance at his friend, saw the manic gleam in Marco's eyes. Are you insane? We could end up frying ourselves. Maybe, Marco admitted, already tearing open a control panel and rummaging through the wiring. But it's our only shot. If we're going to die anyway, I'd rather go out fighting. Dylan hesitated for a split second, then nodded grimly. Do it. Marco worked frantically, his fingers flying over the controls even as the Loyalists closed in. The reactor began to hum and throb, its energies swirling faster and faster. Dylan felt a tingling sensation spread through his body, a sudden rush of power and vitality. His wounds knitted themselves shut, his fatigue vanishing in a surge of raw, unbridled strength. Beside him, the surviving AUG troopers straightened, their eyes glowing with the same fierce energy. Now, Marco yelled, his voice barely human over the roar of the reactor. Hit them with everything you've got! The AUG troopers charged, their bodies blazing with the reactor's power. They crashed into the Loyalist ranks like a tidal wave, fists and feet smashing through armor and bone with sickening ease. The Cations fought back desperately, but they were no match for the supercharged humans. In a matter of minutes, it was over. The Loyalists lay broken and bleeding, their weapons scattered and useless. Dylan stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, the reactor's energy still coursing through his veins. He turned to Pollux, saw the same stunned disbelief in the ambassador's eyes. Is it over? Dylan asked, his voice raw. Did we win? Pollux nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his feline features. Yes, Lieutenant. Thanks to you and your soldiers, the war is finally over. My people owe you a debt we can never repay. Dylan looked around at the survivors, AUG troopers and Cation rebels alike. They were battered and bloodied, their armor scorched and rent. But in their eyes, he saw the same flicker of hope, the same desperate, unquenchable desire for peace. We all owe each other, he said softly. Human and Cation alike. We've lost too much, sacrificed too much to let old hatreds divide us now. He reached out a hand, clasped Pollux's paw in a gesture of friendship and solidarity. Let's build a future together, Dylan said. his voice ringing with conviction, one where our children never have to know the horrors of war. And as the reactor's glow faded, as the Arcturus starbase shuddered and groaned around them, Dylan knew that the true battle was just beginning. The battle for understanding, for forgiveness, for a tomorrow where Org and natural, human and Cation could live in harmony. It would be a hard road fraught with obstacles and setbacks, but for the first time in years, Dylan dared to hope, to believe that a better world was possible. And he knew that he and his fellow survivors, forged in the crucible of war, would be the ones to lead the way. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of battle faded, the true cost of their victory became apparent. The once proud Arcturus starbase was a shattered husk, its corridors choked with debris and the bodies of the fallen. Dylan and Marco picked their way through the wreckage, their augmented bodies still thrumming with the residual energy of the reactor core. Around them, the surviving Org troopers and their Cation allies tended to the wounded, their faces grim and haunted. The medics worked tirelessly, using every scrap of supplies and equipment they could salvage, but for many, it was already too late. Dylan knelt beside the broken form of a young Org trooper, his armor shattered and his face pale beneath the blood. The soldier's eyes fluttered open, locking onto Dylan's with a desperate intensity. "Did we win, sir?" he rasped, his voice barely audible over the hiss of his damaged augmetics. "Did we stop them?" Dylan clasped the trooper's hand, feeling the fading warmth of his skin. "Yeah, kid, we won. The Cations are pulling back. The war's over." A ghost of a smile crossed the young soldier's face. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." His eyes drifted shut, his breath rattling in his chest. Dylan bowed his head, a silent prayer on his lips. He'd lost count of how many had fallen under his command, how many brave souls had given their lives to buy humanity a future. Beside him, Marco placed a hand on his shoulder, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We'll make sure they didn't die for nothing," he said softly. "We'll build a better world, one where Org and natural can live in peace." Dylan nodded, rising to his feet. There was still so much to do, so many challenges ahead, but for now they had to focus on the living, on those who had survived the crucible of war. As they made their way to the command center, Pollux rushed to meet them, his face alight with a mix of joy and relief. "My father just sent word," he said breathlessly. "The peace faction has taken control of the government. They're ready to open negotiations with your people for a formal end to the war." For a moment, Dylan could hardly believe what he was hearing. After so many years of fighting, of watching friends and comrades fall, the idea of peace seemed almost too good to be true. But as he looked around at the battered but unbroken survivors, human and Cation alike, he knew that this was a chance they had to seize with both hands. In the days that followed, Dylan and Marco found themselves thrust into the spotlight, hailed as the heroes who had turned the tide of the war. They were paraded before cheering crowds, their names and faces splashed across every news feed and hollow screen. But even as they basked in the adulation, they couldn't forget the price that had been paid, the lives that had been lost. In quiet moments, they mourned their fallen comrades, the Org troopers who had given everything to secure humanity's future. And they knew that their own time was running out. With each passing day, they could feel the toll of their augmentations, the strain on their bodies and minds. They had fought and bled and sacrificed, but in the end, they were still living on borrowed time. Determined to make that time count, Dylan and Marco threw themselves into the fight for a cure. They lobbied the UNSF brass, called in every favor, and pulled every string they could to secure more funding and resources for the AUG scientists. At first, progress was slow, the bureaucracy and red tape seemingly insurmountable. But then a surprising ally emerged, Pollux, the Cation ambassador who had once been their enemy. In a gesture of goodwill and gratitude, Pollux offered to share the most advanced Cassian medical technology with the UNSF, opening up new avenues of research and experimentation. With this influx of knowledge and resources, the Orc scientists made rapid strides, their work taking on a new urgency. And as the first promising results began to trickle in, Dylan and Marco dared to hope that they might yet live to see a future beyond war and death. But even as they fought for their own survival, they never lost sight of the greater goal, the dream of a lasting peace between human and Cation. As the negotiations between the two sides began in earnest, Dylan found himself marveling at the twists of fate that had brought them to this point. From the desperate battles and bitter losses to the unlikely alliances and hard-won victories, every step had led them here, to the threshold of a new era. There was still so much work to be done, so many wounds to heal and bridges to build. But as he looked out over the war-torn landscape, Dylan knew that they had to try. For the sake of the fallen, for the sake of the future, they had to find a way to move forward, together. The road ahead would be tough, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But as Dylan stood shoulder to shoulder with Marco and Pollux, he knew that they would face it head-on, with the same courage and willpower that had carried them through the darkest days of the war. They were Orc troopers, after all. They had been forged in the crucible of battle, tempered by loss and sacrifice, and now they would use that strength to build a better world, one where the children of both races could grow up free from the shadow of war. It was a daunting task, a challenge unlike any they had faced before, but as Dylan looked out over the shattered remains of the Arcturus starbase, he felt a flicker of hope amid the ruin and devastation. They had come so far against all challenges. They had fought and bled and lost, but they had also learned and grown and changed. And in the end, they had found a way to come together, to forge a bond that transcended species and allegiance. As the dust settled and the wounds began to heal, Dylan and Marco threw themselves into the monumental task of building a lasting peace between humanity and the Cations. They spent long hours in conference rooms and lecture halls, sharing their experiences and perspectives with diplomats, politicians, and citizens on both sides of the conflict. At first, progress was slow and painful, with centuries of mistrust and resentment threatening to unravel the fragile truce at every turn. But through sheer force of will and an unwavering commitment to the cause, Dylan and Marco began to make headway, chipping away at the barriers that divided their two species. Meanwhile, in the labs and research facilities of the UNSF, the scientists working on the AUG cure redoubled their efforts, driven by a newfound sense of urgency and purpose. With the influx of Cation technology and knowledge, they made rapid strides, unlocking the secrets of the Orcs' enhanced physiology and developing new treatments to mitigate the devastating side effects of the transformation process. For Dylan and Marco, the promise of a cure was a beacon of hope in an uncertain future. They knew that their time was running out, that every day brought them closer to the inevitable breakdown of their augmented bodies, but they refused to give in to despair, pushing themselves harder than ever in their quest for peace and understanding. It was during one of these grueling negotiation sessions that the first signs of trouble appeared. As Dylan and Marco listened to a heated debate between a UNSF admiral and a Cation diplomat, they noticed a group of AUG troopers enter the room, their faces hard and their eyes cold. At their head was a man Dylan recognized instantly, General Marcus Bragg, a legendary figure in the UNSF military, known for his ruthless tactics and uncompromising stance on alien threats. Bragg had been a vocal critic of the peace process from the beginning, arguing that humanity should press its advantage and establish dominance over the Cations and other alien races. As Bragg strode to the front of the room, his augmented frame towering over the assembled delegates, Dylan felt a chill run down his spine. There was something different about these Orcs, something unsettling in their posture and demeanor. They moved with a fluid, almost inhuman grace, their eyes glinting with a feral intensity that set them apart from the other Orc troopers Dylan had known. "Gentlemen," Bragg began, his voice dripping with disdain, "I am here to put an end to this farce of a peace process. The Cations cannot be trusted, and any attempt to negotiate with them is a betrayal of everything we fought for." The room erupted into chaos, with shouts of anger and disbelief from the UNSF and Cation delegates alike. But Bragg remained unmoved, his gaze fixed on Dylan and Marco with a predatory intensity. "You two," he said, pointing a finger at them, "you're a disgrace to the ARG program, selling out your own kind for a chance to play nice with the fur-faces." Dylan bristled at the accusation, his augmented muscles tensing beneath his uniform. "We're trying to build a better future, Bragg, one where humans and Caitians can live in peace." Bragg laughed, a harsh grating sound that set Dylan's teeth on edge. "Peace? There can be no peace with the alien menace. The Orcs are the future of human evolution, and we will use them to establish our rightful place as the dominant species in the galaxy." With a sinking feeling, Dylan realized that Bragg was not alone in his views. Many of the ARG troopers in the room were nodding in agreement, their faces twisted with a zealous fervor that bordered on madness. As the debate raged on, Dylan and Marco huddled together, trying to make sense of the situation. They had always known that some of their fellow ARGs harbored resentment towards the Caitians, but they had never imagined that it could run so deep, or that it could be used to justify such a radical agenda. In the days that followed, they began to piece together the truth behind Bragg's faction. Through whispered conversations and stolen intelligence reports, they learned that the general had been secretly working on his own AUG program, one that prioritized aggression and loyalty over stability and longevity. These new super-Orgs were even more powerful and unpredictable than the original Org troopers, their bodies and minds twisted by experimental treatments and harsh conditioning. And now, Bragg planned to use them to overthrow the UNSF government and seize control of the military, establishing a new order based on AUG supremacy and human dominance. For Dylan and Marco, the revelation was a bitter pill to swallow. They had always believed that the Orgs were a necessary evil, a desperate measure taken to ensure humanity's survival in the face of an overwhelming threat. But now, they were forced to confront the ugly truth that some of their own kind had become the very thing they fought against, a threat to peace and stability in the galaxy. As Bragg's plans began to unfold, Dylan and Marco found themselves caught in the middle of a new conflict, torn between their loyalty to their fellow Orgs and their commitment to the cause of peace. With time running out and the cure for their condition still incomplete, they knew that they would have to make a choice, one that could determine the fate of not just humanity, but the entire galaxy. In the end, it was Marco who made the decision for them. In a moment of quiet reflection, he turned to Dylan, his face lined with pain and grit. "We have to stop Bragg," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even if it means going against our own kind. We didn't fight this war just to become the monsters we were trying to defeat." Dylan nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the task before them. He knew that they were taking a tremendous risk, that they could be branded as traitors and hunted down by their fellow Orgs. But he also knew that they had no choice. The stakes were too high, the consequences too dire to ignore. Together, they began to plan their next move, reaching out to their allies in the UNSF and the Caitian government, gathering what resources and intelligence they could. They knew that they were in for the fight of their lives, that Bragg and his super-Orgs would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. But they also knew that they had something that Bragg and his followers did not, a sense of purpose, a belief in something greater than themselves. They were fighting not just for their own survival, but for the future of their species, for the chance to build a world where humans and aliens could live in harmony. As they prepared for the coming storm, Dylan felt a sense of calm settle over him, a clarity of purpose that he had never known before. He looked at Marco, at the determined set of his jaw and the fire in his eyes, and knew that they were ready for whatever lay ahead. They were Org troopers, the last line of defense against the darkness, and they would not fail no matter the consequences. The first blow came in the dead of night, as Dylan and Marco slept in their quarters on the starbase. The sound of gunfire and screams tore through the halls, jolting them awake with a start. They leapt from their bunks, reaching for their weapons and armor with practiced ease. As they raced into the corridor, they were met with a scene of utter chaos. Org troopers, their eyes blazing with a feral intensity, gunning down UNSF soldiers and Caitian diplomats with ruthless efficiency. At their head was Bragg, his augmented body overflowing with advanced weaponry, and his face twisted in a snarl of triumph. He turned to face Dylan and Marco, his eyes glinting with malice. "Well, well, well," he sneered. "The traitors decide to show their faces at last. I was wondering when you'd crawl out of hiding and face me like men." Dylan raised his weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger. "It's over, Bragg. You're outnumbered and outmatched. Surrender now, and we can end this without any more bloodshed." Bragg laughed, a harsh grating sound that sent shivers down Dylan's spine. "Outnumbered? Outmatched? You have no idea what you're up against, boy." With a flick of his wrist, Bragg summoned a squad of super-orgs, their bodies rippling with barely contained power. They moved with a fluid, almost inhuman grace, their eyes glinting with a predatory intensity that made Dylan's blood run cold. "So you see," Bragg continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "while you were busy playing diplomat, I was creating the future of our species. These orgs are faster, stronger, and more loyal than you could ever hope to be. And now, they will help me cleanse the galaxy of the alien menace and establish human dominance once and for all." Dylan felt a surge of anger course through him, his augmented muscles tensing beneath his armor. He looked at Marco, saw the same rage and drive in his friend's eyes. Together they charged forward, their weapons blazing as they met the super-orgs head-on. The battle was fierce and brutal, with both sides taking heavy casualties. Dylan and Marco fought with everything they had, their augmented bodies pushed to the limit as they dodged and weaved through the hail of gunfire. But even with their skill and experience, they were outmatched by Bragg's super-orgs. The new breed of org troopers moved with a speed and precision that defied belief, their enhanced reflexes and strength allowing them to shrug off wounds that would have felled a normal human. As the battle raged on, Dylan saw Marco go down, his body riddled with bullets and his face contorted in agony. He felt a surge of rage and despair well up inside him, a primal scream tearing from his throat as he charged forward, his weapon blazing. But it was no use. The super-orgs were too fast, too strong. Dylan felt a searing pain rip through his chest as a burst of gunfire caught him square in the torso, his armor shattering like glass. He stumbled and fell, his vision blurring as he struggled to stay conscious. Through the haze of pain and confusion, he saw Bragg standing over him, a cruel smile playing across his lips. "Such a waste," the general said, shaking his head in mock pity. "You could have been one of us, Campbell. You could have been part of something greater than yourself, but instead you chose to betray your own kind, to side with the enemy." Dylan coughed, tasting blood on his lips. "You're wrong, Bragg," he rasped. "The Caitians aren't the enemy, they never were. The real enemy is hatred, fear, and ignorance, and that's what you and your super-orgs represent." Bragg's face twisted in anger, his augmented fist clenching at his side. "Spare me your moralizing, Campbell. You're a relic of the past, a fossil clinging to outdated ideals. The future belongs to the strong, to those willing to do whatever it takes to ensure human supremacy." With a final sneer, Bragg raised his weapon, aiming it squarely at Dylan's head. "Goodbye, traitor. May your death serve as a warning to all those who would stand in the way of progress." Dylan closed his eyes, bracing himself for the end, but the shot never came. Instead, he heard a deafening roar, a sound that shook the very foundations of the starbase. His eyes snapped open, widening in disbelief at the sight before him. There, charging down the corridor like a raging bull, was Marco, his body glowing with an otherworldly energy, and his face twisted in a snarl of pure, unadulterated rage. "Get away from him, you bastard!" Marco roared, his voice booming like thunder. He slammed into Bragg with the force of a freight train, sending the general flying across the room and into the far wall. The super-orgs turned to face this new threat, their weapons raised and their faces contorted in confusion and fear. But Marco was too fast, too strong. He moved like a whirlwind, his augmented body pulsing with a power that Dylan had never seen before. With a series of devastating blows, Marco tore through the ranks of the Super Orcs, his fists and feet a blur of motion as he struck down one enemy after another. Dylan watched in awe as his friend single-handedly turned the tide of the battle, his fury and perseverance a force to be reckoned with. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The last of the Super Orcs fell to the ground, their bodies broken and lifeless. Bragg lay in a crumpled heap, his augmented frame shattered beyond repair. Marco stood over him, his chest heaving and his eyes blazing with a fierce, unyielding light. He turned to Dylan, a small smile playing across his lips. "I told you I had a few tricks up my sleeve," he said, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "Looks like that cure research paid off after all." Dylan stared at his friend in disbelief, his mind turning with the implications of what he had just witnessed. If Marco had been able to tap into some hidden reserve of power, some untapped potential within his augmented body, then perhaps there was still hope for the Orcs after all. But there was no time to dwell on such thoughts now. The starbase was in chaos, the halls echoing with the sounds of fighting and the screams of the dying. They had to act quickly to secure the base and ensure that Bragg's coup attempt was well and truly crushed. Together, Dylan and Marco made their way through the corridors, rallying what remained of the loyal UNSF forces and the Caitian diplomats. They fought with a renewed sense of purpose, their bodies and minds pushed to the limit as they worked to restore order and bring an end to the violence. It was a long and brutal struggle, with casualties on both sides. But in the end they emerged victorious, the starbase secure, and the threat of the Super Orcs neutralized. As the dust settled and the wounds began to heal, Dylan and Marco found themselves once again at the forefront of the peace process, their actions in thwarting Bragg's coup earning them the respect and admiration of both the UNSF and the Caitian government. But even as they worked to build a new future, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that their struggles were not nearly finished. Bragg may have been defeated, but his ideas and his hatred still lingered, a cancer eating away at the very heart of the Org program. And then there was the matter of the cure, the tantalizing promise of a life beyond the constant pain and the looming specter of death. If Marco had been able to tap into some hidden potential within his augmented body, then perhaps there was still hope for them all. But such questions would have to wait for another day. For now there was work to be done, a peace to be forged in the crucible of war and suffering. Dylan and Marco had fought too hard, sacrificed too much to let this chance slip away. They were Orc troopers, the last line of defense against the darkness, and they would see this through to the end, despite the toll. The air crackled with tension as Dylan and Marco faced off against Bragg and his loyal followers in the heart of the rogue Orc compound. The two soldiers stood tall, their augmented bodies coiled with readiness, their faces grim and determined. "Bragg, listen to us," Dylan implored, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We're all Args here. We've all fought and bled for humanity. But what you're doing, what you're planning, it's not right. It goes against everything we stand for." Marco nodded, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with his friend. "The Orgs were created to protect our species, not to rule over others. If we go down this path, we're no better than the threats we've fought against." But Bragg merely sneered, his eyes glinting with a fanatic light. "You're both fools," he spat, his augmented body overflowing with barely contained aggression. "The Orgs are the future of human evolution. We're meant to dominate, to crush any who stand in our way. And that includes the Caitians and traitors like you." With a roar of rage, Bragg launched himself at Dylan, his enhanced speed and strength turning him into a blur of motion. Dylan reacted instantly, his own Org reflexes kicking into overdrive as he met Bragg's charge head-on. The two soldiers clashed in a whirlwind of blows, their augmented bodies pushed to the limit as they traded punches and kicks that would have shattered normal human bones. Around them, the other rogue Orgs and Bragg's super soldiers surged forward, engaging Marco and the Caitian special forces in a brutal melee. Pollux fought like a demon, his feline agility and razor-sharp claws more than a match for the rogue Orc's brute strength. He whirled and slashed, his movements a blur as he cut down one enemy after another. Marco, too, was a force to be reckoned with, his Orc body glowing with the same strange energy that had saved them on the starbase. He moved like a juggernaut, his fists smashing through armor and bone alike as he carved a path through the enemy ranks. But it was the duel between Dylan and Bragg that was the centerpiece of the battle, a clash of ideals as much as a contest of strength and skill. They grappled and struck, their faces inches apart as they snarled and strained. "You're on the wrong side of history, Campbell," Bragg growled, his breath hot against Dylan's face. "The Orcs are the master race. It's our destiny to rule." Dylan shook his head, even as he deflected a crushing blow that would have caved in his skull. "You're delusional, Bragg. The Orcs are protectors, not conquerors. We're meant to serve, not to dominate." With a burst of strength, Dylan broke free of Bragg's grip and launched a devastating counter-strike. His fists a blur of motion as he rained blows down upon his opponent. Bragg staggered back, his armor dented and his face bloodied, but still he refused to yield. "I'll kill you," he snarled, his voice thick with hate. "I'll kill you all." He charged again, his movements erratic and desperate now, but no less deadly. Dylan met him head-on, pouring every ounce of his strength and speed into the fight. In the end, it was a single crushing blow that decided the battle. Dylan's fist, augmented to the point of indestructibility, smashed into Bragg's chest with the force of a wrecking ball. The rogue Orc leader flew backwards, his body slamming into the wall with a sickening crunch. But even as Dylan stood over his fallen foe, he felt a sudden wrenching pain tear through his own body. His Orc systems, pushed beyond their limits by the strain of the battle, were failing, the very enhancements that had made him superhuman now turning against him. He staggered and fell, his vision blurring as warnings flashed across his HUD. He could feel his organs shutting down, his blood turning to fire in his veins. "Dylan!" Marco's voice, raw with anguish, cut through the haze of pain. Strong arms wrapped around him, cradling him as he gasped and shuddered. "I'm here, buddy," Marco said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm right here." Dylan looked up at his friend, his brother in all but blood. He could see the devastation in Marco's eyes, the knowledge that, for all their struggles and sacrifices, this was the end of the line. "We did it," Dylan whispered, his voice a ragged croak. "We stopped him. We gave them a chance." Marco nodded, his face a mask of grief. "You did it, Dylan. You saved us all." Dylan managed a faint smile, even as the last of his strength ebbed away. "We saved each other," he breathed. "That's what Orcs do." And with those final words, Dylan Campbell, the hero who had given everything to defend his species and forge a path to peace, slipped away, his Orc body finally succumbing to the inexorable toll of his enhancements. But even as Marco wept over his fallen friend, he knew that Dylan's sacrifice had not been in vain. With Bragg and his rogue Orcs defeated, the threat to the fragile alliance between humanity and the Caitians had been eliminated. The peace process could continue, the dream of a better future for both species suddenly, tantalizingly within reach. And though the cost had been high, the price paid in blood and tears and shattered Orc bodies, Marco knew that it had been worth it. For in the end, the Orcs had proven themselves to be what they had always been meant to be, not conquerors or tyrants, but guardians and protectors, willing to lay down their lives for the greater good. As he laid Dylan's body down gently, Marco straightened, his eyes hard with grit. There was still work to be done, a legacy to be upheld, and he would not rest until his friend's dream of a galaxy at peace was finally, truly realized. In the days following the climactic battle, the Arcturus starbase became a hub of activity as the UNSF and Caitian forces worked to secure the area and begin the long process of rebuilding. Amidst the bustle of repair crews and medics, a solemn ceremony was held to honor those who had fallen in the fight against Bragg's rogue Orc faction. Marco stood at attention, his battered armor still bearing the scars of the fierce combat. Beside him, Pollux and a contingent of Caitian soldiers who had fought alongside the Orc troopers in the final assault stood in respectful silence. As the names of the dead were read aloud, Marco felt a wave of grief wash over him, his enhanced senses picking up the muffled sobs and hitched breaths of those around him. But it was when Dylan's name was spoken that Marco felt the full weight of his loss. His friend, his brother-in-arms, the one who had stood by him through every trial and hardship of the war, gone, sacrificed for the sake of a future he would never see. As the ceremony concluded and the attendees began to disperse, Marco found himself lingering by the makeshift memorial wall, his gaze fixed on the image of Dylan's face etched into the polished metal. Pollux approached quietly, placing a clawed hand on the Org trooper's shoulder. "He was a true hero," the Caitian said softly, his feline eyes glistening with unshed tears. "His sacrifice will not be forgotten." Marco nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. "He always put others before himself," he murmured, "right up until the end." The two stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of their shared loss hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Pollux spoke again, his voice low and earnest. "I know it doesn't feel like it now, but his death was not in vain. Thanks to him and to all of you, we have a chance at a real, lasting peace, a chance to build a better future for both our species." Marco sighed, tearing his gaze away from Dylan's image to look at the Caitian. "I want to believe that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But sometimes it feels like all we've done is bought ourselves a little more time, like we're just delaying the inevitable." He tapped his chest, where the advanced Org systems that kept him alive hummed and whirred beneath his skin. "We're living on borrowed time, Pollux. Every day, every hour, our bodies are breaking down a little more. And without a cure—" He trailed off, unable to give voice to the grim reality that haunted him and his fellow Orgs. Pollux's grip on his shoulder tightened, his claws digging into the battle-scarred armor. "Then we will find a cure," the Caitian said fiercely. "We will pour every resource, every scrap of knowledge and technology we have into the research. We owe you that much and more." Marco managed a faint smile, the first real one in what felt like an eternity. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." As they left the memorial behind and stepped out into the bustling corridors of the starbase, Marco couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into an uncertain future. The war might be over, but for him and his fellow Orgs, the real fight was just beginning, a fight against time, against the very enhancements that had made them into heroes. But as he looked around at the humans and Caitians working side by side to rebuild what had been lost, he felt a flicker of hope amidst the grief and uncertainty. If they could come together like this, after centuries of hatred and bloodshed, then perhaps anything was possible. Perhaps even a miracle. In the weeks and months that followed, Marco threw himself into the cure research with a single-minded perseverance. He worked tirelessly alongside the UNSF and Caitian scientists, poring over data and running countless simulations, pushing his enhanced mind to its limits in search of a breakthrough. But progress was maddeningly slow, each promising lead seeming to dead-end in a maze of complications and setbacks. The Orgs' bodies, pushed far beyond their natural limits by the experimental treatments, were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The very enhancements that had made them so formidable now turning against them with a vengeance. Marco watched helplessly as his fellow Org troopers succumbed one by one to the ravages of their condition, their bodies giving out, even as their minds remained sharp and clear. He attended too many funerals, spoke too many eulogies, the weight of his own mortality pressing down on him like a physical burden. And yet he refused to give up hope. He clung to the belief that somewhere, in the vast troves of data and experimental results, lay the key to their salvation, a way to stabilize their enhancements and grant them the normal lifespans they had sacrificed in the name of duty and honor. Even as his own body began to falter, his Org systems requiring more and more frequent maintenance and repair, Marco poured himself into the work. He spent long hours in the lab, barely sleeping or eating, his mind consumed with the problem that had become his life's mission. It was during one of these marathon research sessions, that a message came through on his private comm channel. A message from Pollux, marked with the highest priority coding. "Marco," the Caitian's voice crackled over the link, taut with barely controlled excitement. "We've found something that could change everything. You need to come to the main research facility immediately." Marco felt his heart leap in his chest, a sudden surge of adrenaline flooding his system. Could it be? After all this time, all this heartache and loss, had they finally found the breakthrough they so desperately needed? He wasted no time in making his way to the research facility, his org-enhanced speed allowing him to cover the distance in a blur of motion. When he arrived, he found Pollux waiting for him, along with a team of UNSF and Caitian scientists, their faces alight with a cautious hope. "What is it?" Marco asked breathlessly, his eyes darting over the banks of equipment and data screens that filled the room. "What have you found?" Pollux gestured to one of the scientists, a human woman with short graying hair and a fierce intelligence in her eyes. "Dr. Novak, please explain." The scientist stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she called up a complex series of diagrams and equations on the main display. "We've been studying the data from the Caitian medical archives," she began, her voice tight with barely contained excitement. "And we think we've found a way to modify the AUG enhancement process at a fundamental level." She pointed to a section of the diagram where a series of glowing nodes pulsed and shifted in an intricate dance. "By incorporating certain Caitian genetic sequences into the AUG matrix, we believe we can create a more stable, self-sustaining system, one that won't degrade over time like the current models." Marco felt a surge of hope rise in his chest, so intense it was almost painful. "Are you saying—" Dr. Novak nodded, her eyes shining with a fierce, determined light. "If our calculations are correct, this could effectively halt the degradation process in AUGs. It could give you and your fellow soldiers a normal lifespan." For a long moment, Marco couldn't speak, his pupils dilating with the implications of what he was hearing. A cure, a real, tangible chance at a future beyond the ticking clock of his own mortality. He looked at Pollux, saw the same hope and disbelief mirrored in the Caitian's eyes. "How soon can we begin trials?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Immediately," Pollux replied, his tone firm and resolute. "We have volunteers ready and waiting. But Marco—" The Caitian paused, his expression turning somber. "You must understand, this is still highly experimental. There are risks involved and no guarantees of success." Marco nodded, his jaw clenching with a fierce, unshakable purpose. "I understand," he said quietly, "but we have to try. For Dylan, and for all the others, we've lost. We have to see this through, no matter the consequences." And so, with a sense of grim purpose, Marco and the remaining AUG troopers submitted themselves to the experimental treatment, their bodies once again becoming the battleground for a desperate all-or-nothing fight against the ravages of time and technology. The process was grueling, the modifications to their AUG systems sending shockwaves of pain and disorientation through their already battered bodies. But they endured, clinging to the hope that this time the sacrifice would be worth it, that this time they would emerge not just as weapons of war but as something more, something with a chance at a real future. As the weeks turned to months, the results of the treatment began to manifest. Slowly at first, then with a growing sense of wonder and disbelief, the constant aches and pains that had plagued the AUGs for so long began to recede, their bodies healing and regenerating at a rate that defied their previous limitations. And yet, even as they marveled at their newfound vitality, Marco and his comrades knew that their work was just getting started. The war may have ended, but the scars it had left on the galaxy, on the worlds and peoples caught in its devastating wake, would take far longer to heal. And so, with a sense of unbreakable spirit, the AUGs took on a new mission, to use their remaining time and resources to help rebuild what had been lost, to forge a new path forward for both humans and Caitians alike. They became ambassadors of peace and cooperation, working tirelessly to bridge the gaps of mistrust and hatred, that had fueled the conflict for so long. They lent their strength and their skills to the reconstruction efforts, using their enhanced abilities to clear rubble, erect shelters, and provide aid to those in need. And through it all, Marco never forgot the promise he had made to himself, the vow he had taken in the aftermath of Dylan's death, to make their sacrifice mean something, to build a future worthy of the price they had paid. Even as the years began to take their toll, as the first signs of age began to creep into his once invulnerable body, Marco refused to slow down, refused to rest on his laurels. He knew that the work of peace was never truly finished, that there would always be new challenges to face, new bridges to build. And so, he pushed himself harder than ever, driven by a fierce, unyielding willpower to see his mission through to the end. He became a living symbol of the Orcs' legacy, a testament to the power of sacrifice and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Until, at last, on a warm, sunny day in a park that had once been a battlefield, Marco found himself sitting on a bench, his aged body finally beginning to succumb to the inexorable march of time. Around him, the laughter of children filled the air, human and Caitian alike, their innocent joy a balm to his weary soul. He watched them play, a faint smile tugging at his weathered features, and felt a sense of peace wash over him, a contentment born of the knowledge that he had done his part to make their world a better place. And as he closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face and the gentle breeze rustling through the trees, he saw a familiar figure walking towards him, a ghostly silhouette against the bright, shimmering light. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.